The shove came from behind, 2 hands flat against Eli Marsh's shoulder blades, and then the gate grill was already sliding up into the ceiling groove, and there was nowhere left to plant his feet but sand. "In you go, wet blood," Kes Dorrell said, low enough that the proctor's aid by the gate winch wouldn't catch it, and he watched the human stumble 2 steps onto the amber floor before catching his own balance like a man stepping off a moving transport. No flailing, no grab for the wall. Kes filed that away without meaning to. The gate ground shut behind Eli with a note that carried through the whole pit floor, a low iron cord that made the cadets in the gallery above go quiet the way they always did at the start of a proving. And up on the rail Kes pressed both hands to the warm stone and told himself this was still just a joke that had gotten slightly out of hand. It had not gotten slightly out of hand. It had gotten entirely out of hand 3 days ago, when Threll Barrow walked into the roster office with a forged assignment chit and pulled Eli Marsh's name off the standard randomizer and set it down, deliberately, next to the designation of the one Quarn in the compound nobody drew on purpose. Kes hadn't known that part until an hour ago. He was still deciding what to do about it. Below him, 40 feet down a wall of fused stone the color of old honey, the pit itself opened out flat and wide, floored in raked sand the temperature of a held breath, ringed by a gallery 3 tiers deep, where 200 second-years leaned on the rail to watch one of their own get evaluated for nerve. That was the whole purpose of the proving, stripped of ceremony. Could a cadet hold still and hold quiet within arm's reach of something that could kill him, long enough to prove he wouldn't panic the first time real command asked it of him? Most cadets drew a young Quarn, barely weaned off creche feed, dozy and slow, and about as dangerous as a park transport. Eli Marsh had drawn the war drum. Nobody called it by its catalog number. Everybody called it the war drum because of the sound it made low in its throat sac when it decided something in its territory needed ending, a subsonic thrum you felt in your molars before you heard it in your ears. It had put 2 cadets out of the officer track in the 6 years Kes had been at Ordesa. One still couldn't fully close his left hand. The other hadn't come back to finish the term at all. Ordesa had accepted its first human cadets 9 years before Eli's cohort walked through the gate, in the last clause of a treaty nobody outside the Dorothy Assembly had wanted to sign, and nobody inside it had wanted to honor. The war that ended it, 3 years of border skirmishing along a debated relay corridor that human ships had helped hold, at a cost the Assembly's own historians were still arguing over, had bought exactly 9 seats a year on the officer commission track, out of roughly 400 cadets total, for any outside species willing to compete for them. Humans were not the only outside species to take up the offer. There were 2 Varen in the 3rd-year cohort and a lone Kethsari in engineering track. But humans were the newest arrivals, the ones whose biology the compound's own medical staff still hadn't finished cataloging, and they were also, Eli had learned fast, the ones certain families had never forgiven the Assembly for admitting at all. He'd known about the quota before he ever put in for the track, the way you know about weather ahead of a trip, an abstract fact you nod at, and then forget to actually plan around. He hadn't understood the weight of it until his 2nd week at Ordesa, standing in a supply line behind 2 third-years arguing, in common loud enough for him to follow every word, about whether letting a wet blood test for command was a treaty obligation or a mistake the Assembly would spend the next century correcting. Neither of them had lowered their voice when he stepped up to the counter. He hadn't said anything back. He'd learned that much from 4 years of small-town wrestling tournaments where the crowd was never on his side either. You didn't win an argument in a supply line. You won it on the mat, or in this case, in the tactics rankings and the physical evaluations, where the numbers didn't care what anyone's grandfather had said about the founding charter. He had arrived at Ordesa 11 months before that mess hall table, on a transport crowded with cargo pallets and 2 other human cadets he would not see again, after processing sorted them into different tracks. And the first thing he'd understood about the place, before he'd learned a single word of the tactics curriculum, was that the compound had been built by people who had never once needed to plan for someone his size. The doorframes cleared his head by a hand's width less than they cleared a Dorothy's. The bunks ran a foot short. The mess hall trays were scaled to four-fingered hands, and he'd spent his first week dropping his fork more than eating with it, watched by upperclassmen who logged the fact without comment and filed it, he suspected correctly, under evidence. Kes Doral had been assigned to run orientation drills for the incoming human cadets that term, a duty handed down to second years the way any tedious duty was handed down, and he remembered vaguely, in the loose, unbothered way you remember something before it matters, a skinny human boy at the back of the unarmed drill's yard who took every correction without arguing, and then did the correction slightly wrong on purpose the second time, adjusting it to fit whatever his own body actually did instead of what the Dorothy textbook said it should do. Kes had thought, at the time, that it was stubbornness. He understood later, from the vantage of a stone bench outside the amber pit, that it had been something closer to translation. A boy taking instructions built for a four-limbed frame and quietly, patiently, turning them into instructions his own two-limbed one could use. They had sparred exactly once that first week, a mandatory pairing drill that put every incoming cadet against an upperclassman for a single evaluated round, and Kes had gone into it expecting nothing, because the roster listed the human's mass at less than half his own, and the manual on cross-species unarmed drills, 3 pages, unrevised in longer than the Quarn biology section, described human strength in terms so cautious they amounted to an apology for including humans in contact sport at all. He had taken Eli Marsh down twice in the first 30 seconds, cleanly, the way size was supposed to settle these things, and had been reaching for the third takedown when the boy's hip dropped under his own weight instead of away from it, and Kes found himself, for one disorienting half-second, airborne, before he landed on his back in the yard sand with the human's forearm resting light across his throat and no real force behind it at all. A demonstration, not a submission. The wrestling equivalent of a hand held out flat to show it wasn't a fist. "Sorry," Eli had said, pulling back immediately, sounding like he meant it. "Wasn't trying to make a point. That's just where my hips go." Kes had gotten up without answering, brushed the sand from his plates, and told himself for the rest of that week that it had been a fluke, a lucky angle, nothing that would repeat itself against someone who wasn't caught leaning the wrong way. He had not sparred against Eli Marsh again after that, by his own quiet, unspoken choice, and he understood now, years too late to matter, that some small, ungenerous part of him had spent 11 months since then waiting for a chance to even a ledger that Eli Marsh had never once known he was keeping. Ressa Ilvin had watched that same drill from the yard's edge, waiting her own turn in the pairing rotation, and had filed it away the way she filed away everything useful, not as a story to tell, but as data. A first-year human had put a second-year Dorothy on his back using an angle nobody at Ordesa taught on his first week, without malice or showmanship, and had then apologized for it as if winning had been the accident and not the plan. She had not spoken to him about it. She had not spoken to him at all, in fact, in the 11 months since, a fact that would trouble her later, standing at the gallery rail watching him hum a wordless note at a killer, in a way she hadn't expected an 11-month silence to trouble her at all. He wrote to his father every week after that, a habit he'd have laughed at anyone else keeping, and never once considered dropping himself, because it was the one part of the day that still felt like it belonged to Nebraska, and not to a compound built light years from anything that smelled like clover. Most weeks the letters were short, a line about a drill, a line about a meal he couldn't identify, a question about the bees that wouldn't get answered for 3 weeks minimum given the relay lag, and his father's replies, when they came, were shorter still, because George Marsh had never been a man who trusted more words than a thing needed. 11 months in, Eli had a small stack of those replies in a drawer under his bunk, worn soft at the folds from being read more times than any of them strictly required, and he had gone to sleep more nights than he'd admit to anyone at Ordesa, with the most recent one still creased open on his chest. By the time Threll Barrow's Dare found him at that mess hall table, Eli had spent 11 months compiling exactly that kind of quiet answer, top third in tactics, mid-pack in unarmed combat, mostly because his instructors kept trying to teach him a fighting style built for four-limbed Dorothy frames instead of the two-limbed leverage he actually had. And a perfect attendance record at every optional field session, because extra hours on the mat were the only currency he had that nobody could take a vote on. He had not expected any of it to matter less than a joke told over cold protein loaf. He was about to learn that it didn't, not directly, that the currency he'd been saving up his whole first year bought him nothing at all in a pit built to test something else entirely. The manual on Quarn biology hadn't been rewritten in 31 years, not since Proctor Ilker first assumed the Amber Pit's oversight, and it showed in the sparseness of it: 2 pages of catalog data, and a single paragraph of handling guidance that every cadet memorized and few of them questioned, because questioning the manual had never once been part of the assignment. It told cadets to remain still. It did not tell them why the 2 cadets who had followed that instruction most faithfully were also the 2 who'd been carried out on stretchers, because the manual's authors, whoever they had been 3 decades ago, had written it from measurements taken on a sedated animal in a medical bay, not from 31 years of watching what actually happened on the sand. 3 days ago, none of this had been anywhere near a plan. It had been a mess hall table, gray protein loaf going cold on 4 trays, and a tactics instructor named Weapons Master Coral running a drill scenario on the wall display for the benefit of anyone still eating. A border skirmish, 3 approach vectors, the kind of problem Ordesa cadets solved a dozen times a term without thinking twice. Kess had called the eastern vector the weak point, the way he always did, because the eastern vector was where the terrain gave the most cover, and cover was where Dorothy doctrine had spent 2 centuries teaching him to expect trouble. "It's the northern vector," Eli Marsh had said, not looking up from his tray, in the flat, unbothered tone of someone correcting a typo rather than an officer cadet 2 years his senior. "Cover cuts both ways. Whoever's dug into that tree line can't see past 30 meters either. The open ground to the north is the one nobody's watching because everybody assumes open ground means exposed. That's exactly why it isn't." Coral had looked at the display for a long moment, then marked the northern vector correct, and moved on to the next scenario without further comment, and that had been the whole of it. 4 seconds. A boy from a species Kess had grown up believing ran too hot-blooded for patient thought, seeing a board better than Kess had seen it in 2 years of trying. The mess hall had gone quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet around a small public correction, and Kess, stinging in a place he didn't like naming, had said the thing that started all of this. "If you're that calm reading a wall display, wet blood, let's see how calm you are somewhere that reads back." He'd meant it as nothing. A joke with teeth, the kind cadets traded constantly, gone by the next meal. He had not expected Threll Barrow, 3 tables down, to hear it, remember it, and turn it into a forged roster chit 72 hours later. The 3 days between the mess hall and the gate had not passed quietly, though Kess had spent most of them pretending they had. He'd found Barrow in the unarmed drills yard the morning after, running solo forms against a training dummy with the kind of controlled fury that meant he was replaying the mess hall exchange in his head for the 10th time. "You're still thinking about it," Kess had said, more statement than question, and Barrow had answered without breaking his rhythm: elbow strike, palm strike, elbow strike, the dummy's frame rocking on its spring mount. "I'm thinking about the commission list," Barrow said. 9 slots. Coral's already flagging Marsh's tactical reads to the ranking board. I heard it from Van, who heard it from the ranking clerk directly. A first-year human outscoring second years on a live drill isn't a curiosity anymore, Kess. It's a data point. And data points get remembered when the board sits down in the spring. So let him outscore you honestly. Barrow had stopped then, dummy still rocking, and looked at Kess with an expression that had none of the easy warmth Kess associated with 2 years of shared meals and shared drills. Honestly, he repeated. You think the charter that let him sit in that mess hall at all was honest? My grandfather's cohort had 40 cadets competing for every seat. Humans get handed for free under a treaty. They didn't even help negotiate. Humans signed it after the fighting was mostly over. Kess, everyone knows that. They just don't say it in the assembly hall where it'd sound ungrateful. I'm not interested in beating him honestly on a board he was never supposed to be allowed to sit at. Kess hadn't had an answer for that at the time, not because he agreed with it, but because 2 years of friendship had trained him to let Barrow's certainty wash past him unchallenged, the way you let weather pass. He'd gone back to his own drills and told himself the matter would cool on its own, the way most mess hall grudges did within a week. It had not cooled. 2 nights later, Kess had woken to the sound of Barrow's bunk light in the dark, in the shared upper-class quarters, and found him at the small fold-down desk with a data slate lit low, the roster office's standard-issue amber glow throwing shadows up across his plated face. Kess hadn't asked what he was doing. He'd told himself, lying back down, that whatever it was, Barrow was smart enough and careful enough that it wouldn't come to anything real. He understood now, watching the gate close on Eli Marsh 2 days later, exactly how much that assumption had cost him to keep believing. Eli, in those same 3 days, had spent them doing the only thing he knew how to do with a problem he couldn't outthink his way past. He trained the parts of it he could control and let the rest go, because his father had taught him a long time ago that worry spent on things outside your hands was worry wasted twice. He hadn't known about the forged chit. Nobody outside the roster office had, until Kess found it an hour before the gate. What Eli had known, from the moment word reached him through the cadet grapevine that his name had been quietly swapped onto a Quarren assignment nobody drew on purpose, was that the animal waiting for him in the amber pit was the one the manual devoted the most cautious paragraph to, and the one every upperclassman he asked about it got a careful, closed look on their face before changing the subject. He'd gone to the compound's small technical library on the second of the 3 nights and read every scrap of documentation Ordesa had on file about Quarren sensory biology, which amounted to 4 pages total, none of them written by anyone who seemed to have spent real time near a live one. It told him almost nothing useful. It told him mostly, by what it left out, that nobody at Ordesa had ever really tried to understand the animal on its own terms, only to survive standing near it. He'd written to his father that second night too, on the compound's slow subspace relay that took 11 days to deliver anything, and 11 more to bring an answer back, which meant that whatever he wrote would not reach Nebraska until long after the proving was over, and whatever his father wrote back wouldn't reach him until long after that. He wrote it anyway, sitting on the end of his bunk with the small stylus the terminal issued, because it steadied something in him to put the shape of the problem into words meant for the one person who'd taught him how to stand still around something that could kill him. Dad got put up for something at the academy that's going to test the stuff you taught me at the yard, the actual stuff, not the wrestling. Might not go well. Wanted you to know I'm not scared the way I used to get scared before I understood what you were teaching me. I think I finally get why you never let me hold my breath around the hives. He hadn't found a way to say more than that without it sounding like a goodbye, so he'd stopped there and sent it, and gone to sleep without much of it in his head at all. A discipline his father had also taught him, the trick of setting a worry down at the door of sleep the same way you set down a tool you're done using for the day. On the second night, after he'd finished the letter and before he let himself sleep, Eli had gone to the compound's small technical library, a squat annex behind the main hall that most cadets used only to print approved study cores and otherwise ignored, and found it staffed at that hour by a lone Varan third year named Vetch, one of only 2 of her species on the whole officer track, and Eli would learn over the next 2 hours. The only living soul at Ordesa, who seemed to have actually read every page of documentation the compound possessed on Quarn biology, instead of just the 1 page the cadet manual excerpted. Varan ran narrower through the shoulder than Dorothy, built low and long with a double-lidded eye that gave them. Eli had heard exceptional night vision and correspondingly poor tolerance for the compound's daylight cycle, which was, he suspected, the real reason Yuan worked the library's overnight rotation, and not merely the official one about seniority scheduling. She looked up when he came in, unhurried, unsurprised, as if first-year cadets researching their own death sentences at midnight were simply part of the furniture. "Wardrum," she said before he'd asked anything, glancing at the search terminal's queue where his own request was still queued behind 3 others. "You drew it. I heard already everyone has." Word moves faster in this compound than the transports do. She didn't ask if he was scared, which he appreciated more than he expected to, and instead turned her chair toward a locked archive shelf that the terminal's standard index didn't surface at all. "The manual you've read is the manual everyone reads. It's wrong. Not maliciously, just incomplete, in the specific way a document written by someone who was afraid the whole time they observed is always incomplete. You've read something else." "I've read the field notes," Yuan said, "from the naturalist who cataloged the species originally. 40 years before your manual was written from her data secondhand by someone who'd never once left the compound. She spent 4 years in the wild range the Quarn come from before the war, before any of this. A small gesture that took in the compound, the pit, the whole apparatus of cadets and quotas and provings, existed at all. Her notes never made it into cadet curriculum because the compound wanted a manual that produced obedient cadets, not curious ones, and her notes were the second thing and not remotely the first." She keyed the terminal without waiting for him to ask, and a scan of yellowed field pages came up in a hand Eli didn't recognize. Careful looping script annotated in the margins with sketches of forelegs and spine clusters that looked, even in crude pencil, more alive than anything the cadet manual's 2 clinical pages had managed. Eli read fast, the way he'd learned to read a defensive formation under a clock, pulling out what mattered and setting the rest aside for later. A note on throat sac rhythm as a social signal between adult Quarn, not merely a threat display. The naturalist had recorded 3 distinct patterns in the wild, and only one of them meant what the compound's manual assumed all of them meant. A note on spine cluster movement as tactile mapping, not merely sensory investigation. An animal that read the world through vibration the way a human read it through sight, and did so continuously, not only when threatened. And near the bottom of the 3rd page, underlined twice in a hand that looked like it had pressed hard enough to nearly tear the paper, "They do not forget a rhythm once it is offered honestly. I regret that I will not live to see anyone test whether that also means they can be offered peace." "She died before she could publish the rest of it," Yuan said, watching him read. "A supply accident, nothing to do with the animals at all. The compound inherited her notes, filed them as historical record instead of doctrine, and wrote a shorter, safer manual instead. One that told cadets to survive the pit instead of understand it, because survival was a testable outcome and understanding wasn't, not on the kind of schedule an officer academy runs on." She looked at him for a long moment with an expression Eli would only fully place later, after everything, as something between professional curiosity and a very old, very quiet species solidarity that never got said aloud at Ordesa, but that outsiders felt from each other anyway, the way 2 people from the same small town recognize something in each other before either says where they're from. "I am telling you this because in 9 years, exactly 2 non-Dorothy cadets have asked this library for anything beyond the assigned index. You are the second, The first was a Varan in his final year, and he asked because he wanted to win an argument in a seminar. You are asking 3 days before you walk into a pit with the animal these notes describe, and I find that I would like you to survive it, for reasons that have very little to do with academic curiosity. Eli copied out what he could in the time he had. Not the whole of it, there wasn't time, and half the naturalist's shorthand needed a translation key he didn't have access to, but enough. The 3 throat sac patterns, roughly sketched, and the underlined line about rhythm offered honestly, which he read 4 more times before he left, and which sat in the back of his mind for the whole of the next 2 days like a stone he kept turning over without fully understanding its shape. He thanked Yuan on his way out, and she said, without looking up from the terminal, in the flat, unbothered tone he would come to recognize later as her version of warmth, "Come back and tell me if it worked. I would like to update my own notes if you live long enough to give me the data." He had not known, walking out of that library into the compound's cool false night, that he would in fact come back, that the data he'd bring her 4 days later would be the first entry in a document that would eventually replace the manual that had failed 2 cadets before him. He only knew at the time that he had one more piece of a puzzle he hadn't had before, and that a piece was worth more than nothing, even if he still had no idea yet whether it would be worth enough. Ressa Ilvain had noticed something was wrong before almost anyone else did. In the particular way, a ranked tactics cadet notices a pattern shifting before she can name it. She'd watched Threll Barrow's usual circuit through the mess hall change over those 3 days, fewer meals at his regular table, more low conversations at the edge of the room with cadets she didn't recognize from his usual circle, a data slate that stayed lit at his elbow through meals he used to eat with his head up, watching the room the way upperclassmen were supposed to. She hadn't put a name to what she was seeing. She'd simply started watching Kess Doral instead, because Kess sat across from Barrow at those same meals now with his shoulders set in a way she'd never seen on him before, like a man carrying something he hadn't agreed to carry and couldn't yet set down. "He's not even in stance," said Threll Barrow, arriving at Kess's elbow with the particular satisfaction of a Dorothy who has just watched a plan clear its first hurdle. Barrow was 2 years ahead of Kess, broader through the shoulder plate, and he had a way of standing close that Kess had never liked and had never said so about. "Look at him. He doesn't even know where the beast is." Down on the sand, Eli Marsh knew exactly where the beast was. It lay against the far curve of the pit wall, low and long, 3.5 meters of gray-plated hide built like something between a bull and a millstone, its wedge of a head resting on crossed forelegs whose spine clusters, 6 to a limb, black and glassy, longer than a man's fingers, were pressed flat into the sand. Its eye spots, vestigial and milk pale, didn't track him. They didn't track anything. Eli had read the single page of the cadet manual on Quarn biology twice before this morning, and it had told him almost nothing except that the animal was blind and that cadets should remain still. And something about the second claim had bothered him from the first time he read it. In the same way, a fence line bothers you when the wire tension is wrong before you can say exactly why. He did not remain still, he breathed. He'd learned to breathe like this a long time before Ordesa, on ground that smelled like clover instead of ozone, standing at the edge of his father's bee yard at 4 in the morning with his hands loose at his sides, while 11 hives worth of insects rose around him in a column, and his father's voice behind him saying low and slow, "Boy, don't you dare hold your breath. They can feel it." Eli hadn't understood what that meant until he was older and had it explained to him by a vet tech who came out twice a year to look at the cattle. Animals that can't see well don't read your face. They read your rhythm. He planted his boots wide, dropped his weight the way 3 years of high school wrestling had carved into his hips before he'd ever set foot off Earth, and started counting his breath in 4s. The wardrum's tail, thick as a fence post, twitched once against the sand. In the gallery, that twitch pulled a ripple of murmurs down the rail, because everyone knew a tail twitch was the animal's version of a man's fingers curling toward a weapon. Kes leaned forward without deciding to. Barrow didn't move at all, watching with the flat attention of someone who had already decided how this would end and was only confirming it in real time. Ressa Ilvain had drawn her own proving 8 months earlier, against a young Quarn barely out of creche feed, the standard assignment every cadet expected and almost none feared. She had passed it cleanly, a footnote in her file next to a tactics ranking that put her second in the whole second-year cohort, and she had never once, in the months since, thought about the amber pit as anything other than a formality she'd already cleared. Watching Eli Marsh stand in open sand across from an animal that had ended 2 careers in 6 years, she found herself recalculating what the formality had actually been worth, and didn't like the answer much. She was not the only one doing that math. Up and down the gallery rail, cadets who had drawn easy Quarn assignments of their own, dozy juveniles, half-grown animals still soft around the spine clusters, watched a first-year human do, on his own initiative and without a page of the manual to guide him, something none of their own careful-by-the-book stillness had ever been tested against. A few of them had the grace to look uncomfortable about it. Most simply watched, the particular hungry silence of an audience that senses, correctly, it is witnessing something it will still be talking about at graduation. Down on the sand, Eli had no attention left to spare for the gallery at all. His whole awareness had narrowed to the specific weight of his own front foot against the sand, the 4 count ticking behind his sternum, and the animal's tail, stilled now, its tip resting flat against the grit instead of raised, and testing the air the way it had been when the gate first opened. He didn't know if stillness in a tail meant what stillness meant in a spooked heifer's ears. He was betting his life that the underlying logic, an animal's body telling the truth its instincts hadn't learned to hide yet, held true across species the same way it had held true across every 4-legged creature he'd ever stood close to back home. It was not a scientific bet. It was the only one he had. The chronoboard over the gate flared to life, amber digits climbing from 0, and a horn Kes had heard 100 times before sounded the start of the first round. 3 minutes. Then the between. Then 3 more if the cadet on the sand chose to stay for them, which most did not, because leaving through the side sally gate at any between carried no penalty at all except the quiet understanding that you had left. Eli Marsh did not look at the sally gate. He looked at the animal and kept counting his breath, and took 1 slow step forward into the widest, flattest patch of open sand he could find, because the ground told a Quarn everything, and he intended to give it something worth hearing. The tail stopped twitching. Kes noticed that too, and hated that he noticed, and hated more that some small, ugly part of him had been hoping to see the boy break in the first 10 seconds, so the rest of this could be simple. It was not going to be simple. He could feel that already, the way you feel a storm front arrive before the sky changes color, and he gripped the rail and made himself keep watching, because whatever this became, he had put the human in that pit with his own dare 3 days ago in the mess hall, over a tactical assessment Eli had corrected in front of an instructor, and Kes Doral did not have the luxury of looking away from what he'd started. 60 seconds and he hasn't taken a real step, Barrow said, sounding pleased. He's letting it come to him. That's not composure, that's paralysis. Watch it decide he's furniture, and then watch it decide he's not. But the wardroom did not decide he was furniture. Its wedge head came up off its crossed forelegs by degrees, the pale eye spots still blind and unreadable, and the spine clusters on its planted foreleg began to shift, not all at once, not the sudden fan of a startle, but a slow individual rippling, spine after spine after spine finding new purchase in the sand, the way a man's fingers spread wide across a table to feel for a tremor, reading him, building him spine by spine into a shape it could understand. Eli kept his weight rocking ounce by ounce, heel to toe, in the same 4-count rhythm the whole time, and somewhere behind his sternum, A voice that sounded like his father told him not to be the first thing in that pit to change its mind. 40 seconds into the round, the wardrum rose. It came up off its crossed forelegs in a single unhurried motion, the plated bulk of it unfolding the way a drawbridge lowers, and took one long testing step across the sand toward the middle of the pit. In the gallery, someone's breath caught loud enough to carry, and a Dorethi cadet named Ressa Ilving, second in the tactics rankings, a year ahead of Kess, a girl who had never once in 3 terms said anything to him beyond a nod in a corridor, gripped the rail hard enough that her knuckles went pale under the plating. "That's a hunting step," Ressa said to nobody to everybody. "That's not a threat posture, that's it deciding to close distance." Eli did not close distance back, and did not open it either. He held his forecount exactly where he was, weight rocking heel to toe in the same unhurried rhythm as before the animal moved at all, offering it nothing new to react to, and the wardrum's second step never came. It stood instead in the open sand, head low, spine clusters splayed wide across the grit in that slow individual testing ripple, close enough now that Eli could hear, for the first time, the faint dry click of plate shifting against plate with every breath it took. "He's not running," Ressa said, quieter now almost to herself. "No," Kess said, surprising himself by answering her at all. "He isn't." Up on the rail, Kess Doral watched a boy from a species his people had spent 2 centuries calling thin-blooded and fast-hearted and unfit for anything requiring nerve, stand in the open sand of the amber pit with a killer 30 feet away, and not once reach for the wall. The horn sounded the end of the first round, and Eli Marsh was still standing. That should have been the end of it, a clean pass, a mark in the log and a story cadets would tell for a week about the wet blood who didn't flinch for 3 minutes. It was not the end of it, because Threll Barrow had not rigged the draw to watch Eli Marsh survive 3 minutes. He had rigged it to watch him fail all 4 rounds and be carried out on a stretcher with his file marked unfit for command track. And there were 3 rounds left, and Barrow had already turned from the rail with the particular stillness of a Dorethi recalculating. Kess saw him do it, and something in his own chest, a Dorethi's chest, slow beating and patient by nature, proud of exactly that patience, went cold in a way 3 years at Ordesa had never made it go before. He had been in the gallery, first term, the day the second cadet washed out against the wardrum. He remembered it clearer than he wanted to now. A boy named Des Carville, confident, well-liked, 3 drills into a promising record, who had done everything the manual told him to do, stood still, kept his hands visible, waited out the clock, and had still ended up on the ground with the wardrum's foreleg pinning his chest and a Proctor's override lever the only thing that pulled it off him in time. Carville had finished the term. He had not come back for the next one. Kess had never once, in 3 years since, wondered why the manual's advice had failed a cadet who'd followed it exactly. He wondered now, watching Eli Marsh ignore that same advice on purpose and get a result nobody in 6 years had gotten. It was the roster office that told him the rest of it, an hour before the gate opened, when Kess had gone looking for the standard randomizer printout out of nothing more than idle unease and found instead a second chit clipped behind it, hand-annotated, Barrow's own looping script down the margin. Reassign M17 to Q11 designation. Cadet unaware. No correction required prior to trial. He had stood in that office a long time, chit in hand, telling himself there was still an innocent explanation, and had not found one, and had put the chit back exactly where he found it and walked to the gallery instead of the officer of the day, because some old ugly loyalty to a friend of 2 years had in that moment weighed more than it should have. He understood Barrow's arithmetic well enough, even if he'd never once said it out loud the way Barrow did. Threll Barrow's clan had sat on the Ordesa admissions board for 4 generations, back to the founding charter, back before the treaty that opened the officer track to outside species at all, and Barrow had grown up at his father's table, hearing the same complaint delivered 100 different ways, that a seat handed to a wetblood was a seat carved out of a line that had waited 3 centuries for it. Kess's own family carried none of that history. His father repaired atmospheric processors on a trade station and had never once mentioned humans to him before Ordesa, and Kess had absorbed Barrow's version of things the easy way you absorb a friend's certainty when you have none of your own yet. Not because he'd examined it and found it sound, but because examining it had never once seemed necessary until a boy from that very species corrected his tactics board in 4 seconds flat. Kess had met Barrow's father exactly once, at a parent's visitation 2 years earlier, a broad-plated Dorothy in a formal service tunic who had shaken Kess's hand with perfect courtesy, and then spent the better part of an hour explaining, unprompted, precisely how many of his own ancestors had sat on the Ordesa admissions board, and precisely how the treaty's outside species clause had been forced through the assembly by delegates who, in his telling, had never once had to compete for anything in their lives. Kess had nodded along at the time the way you nod along at any older relative's grievance, filing it as background noise rather than doctrine. He understood now, watching Barrow's face across the winch station, that it had never been background noise to Barrow at all. It had been an inheritance, handed down as carefully and deliberately as a family sidearm, and Barrow had spent 2 years waiting for a chance to use it. What struck Kess now, turning it over with the particular clarity that comes from watching a friendship curdle in real time, was how little of Barrow's arithmetic had anything to do with Eli Marsh specifically. Barrow had never once in 2 years asked Eli a direct question, never eaten a meal at his table, never sparred against him in a drill yard where actual skill might have been measured honestly. The forged chit wasn't really aimed at a boy from Nebraska who read tactics boards well and hummed at spooked animals. It was aimed at a number on a quota sheet, a treaty clause Barrow's family had never accepted, and a version of the future in which every seat handed to an outside species felt, to men like Barrow's father, like a seat stolen from someone who'd waited 3 centuries for it. Eli Marsh had simply been unlucky enough, or good enough, to become the specific shape that arithmetic decided to take. It did not make Kess feel any better about the 3 days that had led here. If anything, it made the shape of his own complicity clearer and worse. A joke thrown out over cold protein loaf, aimed at nothing in particular, had been picked up by an ideology that had been sharpening itself for 2 years and had simply been waiting for a blade-shaped opportunity to land on. Kess hadn't built the blade. He'd handed over the grip. He thought, standing there, of his own father back on the trade station, a man who fixed atmospheric processors for a living and had never once, in 19 years, mentioned humans to him at all, not with Barrow's inherited grievance, not with anything, because humans had simply never been part of the small, quiet orbit of his father's life. Kess had always assumed that silence meant neutrality. He understood now that it had only ever meant absence, and that absence was its own kind of blank canvas, one Barrow's family had been all too willing to paint on for him before Kess had ever thought to pick up a brush of his own. 90 seconds, said the aide at the winch station, calling the between, and down below the sand, the pit crew began the process cadets called settling. Vents in the floor exhaling a fine mist that cooled the sand, the wardroom lowering itself again against the far wall, its throat sac inflating and deflating in a long, slow rhythm that the manual called ambient noise, and Eli Marsh, standing very still and paying very close attention, did not believe was noise at all. He had 90 seconds to decide whether to walk to the Sally gate or stay for round 2, and he spent the first 30 of them just listening to that throb come up through the soles of his boots, low and even, 4 beats and a rest, 4 beats and a rest, and thought about the hum his father's Holby yard made on a good spring morning when nothing in 11 hives had any reason to be afraid. He did not walk to the Sally gate. Above him, in the gallery, Threll Barrow was already moving down the tier toward the winch station, and Kess Dorrell, watching him go, understood with the flat certainty of a man reading a familiar face that whatever happened in round 2 was not going to be an accident. Kes followed him. He told himself he was only curious. He had told himself that for 3 days, ever since the roster chit changed hands in a corridor Barrow thought was empty, and it had stopped being true the moment the gate ground open on Eli Marsh, and Kes had felt, for one ugly second, the urge to shout a warning down into the pit. He hadn't shouted it. He had stood at the rail instead and watched the joke he'd started turn into something with teeth, and that, more than anything Barrow had done, was the thing Kes couldn't yet look at straight. Barrow reached the winch station and spoke 2 quiet words to the crewman running the resonance drum. The device bolted into the pit's outer wall, whose only sanctioned use was calibration. A single test thump before approving began to confirm the sand bed's conductivity. It was not supposed to sound during a live round. Kes had sat through the safety briefing on it twice. "What did you tell him?" Kes said, close enough now that only Barrow would hear it, and Barrow turned with an expression that had no guilt in it at all, only the mild irritation of a man interrupted mid-task. "I told him to do his job if the wet blood looks too comfortable in round 2, Barrow said. "That's all. A calibration strike, perfectly within regulation." During a live round isn't calibration. During a live round is exactly when we'd need to recalibrate, Barrow said, and smiled. And Kes understood that the smile was the whole answer, and that there was no version of the next 3 minutes in which Threll Barrow let the wardroom simply lie still. "You forged the reassignment," Kes said. "I saw it, this morning in the roster office." Something flickered across Barrow's plated face, there and gone, the first honest surprise Kes had gotten out of him in 2 years. "And you didn't report it?" "I haven't decided to yet." "Then don't start deciding in the next 90 seconds, Barrow said, and the warning in it was plain enough that Kes felt it land somewhere below his sternum ridge. "You dared him into the pit, Kes. Your name is on the mess hall floor as loud as mine is on that chit. If this goes to the officer of the day, it doesn't stay a story about me. It becomes a story about both of us, and only one of us has a citation record clean enough to survive it." He glanced toward the winch crewman, who was watching the exchange with the careful blankness of someone who very much wanted to be somewhere else. "Go back to the rail. Watch the round. You'll feel differently about all of this once he's carried out of there, and this stops being an argument about principle, and starts being one less name ahead of you on the commission list." Kes did not go back to the rail right away. He stood at the winch station a moment longer, weighing a friendship 2 years deep against a boy he'd spoken maybe 40 words to in his entire life, and found, to his own quiet surprise, that the arithmetic had already tipped without his permission. The horn sounded round 2 before Kes could decide what, if anything, he was prepared to do about it. Down on the sand, Eli Marsh felt the second round begin as a change in air pressure before he heard the horn at all. Some faint pull through the vents that told him the pit crew had reopened the flow, and he went back to his 4 count, heel to toe, and watched the wardroom spine clusters resume their slow, individual testing of the ground between them. It had stopped reading him as a threat. He was almost sure of that now, as sure as he'd ever been of anything with an animal that couldn't be asked. Its throat sac had settled into that long, even throb, 4 beats and a rest, and 40 feet away Eli had started, very quietly, to match it. Not with his voice, not yet, just with the timing of his own weight shifting foot to foot, 4 counts down, 1 count still, the exact rhythm a spooked bull yard settles into once every animal in it has decided nothing in the field is worth running from. He took a step closer. The spine clusters rippled once, hard, and stilled again. He held where he was for 6 full breaths before he took the next step. That was when the resonance drum fired. It came up through the sand like a hammer strike through a drum head, a burst of vibration with no rhythm in it at all, nothing like the throb Eli had spent 3 minutes learning to answer, and the effect on the wardroom was immediate and total. Its head came up off the ground in a single violent motion, throat sac flaring wide and pale, and the low throb Eli had been matching broke apart into something faster and higher. A sound the manual had no word for because the manual had never bothered to record what a quarn sounds like a half-second before its whole body decides the ground itself has become a threat. In the gallery, 200 cadets who had been watching a quiet, careful, almost boring demonstration of nerve came up off the rail as one, and Kes Doral felt his own hands close, white-knuckled on the stone before he was aware of moving them. Eli did not run. He wanted to. Every year of his life before this one had wired something into him that screamed run at the sight of a 3.5-meter animal, coming up off its haunches with its head swinging low and its spine clusters fanning wide across the sand like a hand about to close into a fist. And he stood in the open with that scream loud behind his ribs and did not obey it, because his father's voice was louder. Because a bolting man in an open field is the only thing in that field a spooked animal will ever actually chase. He dropped instead, straight down, knees first, one palm flat against the sand, making himself smaller and slower and stiller than anything that runs, and he pressed his open hand into the grit and started tapping it, for an arrest, the only language he had left to offer. The wardrum's charge, if it had been a charge, died in its first stride. It came up short 6 feet from him, forelegs skidding a long dark furrow through the sand, head low and swinging, throat sac working, and for 3 full seconds nothing in the pit moved at all except that flaring pale sac and the boy's one open hand still tapping its patient rhythm into the ground. Then the sac subsided, not all the way. But it subsided, and the spine clusters came down flat against the sand on either side of Eli's kneeling shape, testing him at a range no cadet had survived being tested at in 6 years. And Eli Marsh knelt in the open sand of the amber pit with a killer's head close enough to feel the heat coming off its jaw, and kept tapping, and did not look away, and did not stand. The horn for the end of round 2 sounded into a silence so complete that Kes Doral heard, for the first time in his life, the actual mechanism of the gate winch grinding before it caught. Nobody in the gallery said anything for a long moment. Then somebody 2 tiers down, a Dorothy cadet Kes didn't know well, a girl named Ressa who ran second in tactics, said quietly to no one, "It stopped." It had stopped. Everyone had seen it stop. And that fact alone, more than the resonance drum that shouldn't have fired, more than 3 days of a joke curdling into something Kes didn't have a clean name for, was the thing that made Threll Barrow's face go still and flat in a way Kes had learned, over 2 years of knowing him, to be genuinely afraid of. 90 seconds, called the aide at the winch, and this time her voice had an edge in it that hadn't been there for round 1, because she'd felt that drum fire too, felt it through the deck plating under her own boots, and she was already looking toward the crewman who'd triggered it with a question forming behind her eyes. Down on the sand, Eli Marsh stayed on his knees a long moment after the horn, both because standing too fast might read as a new threat, and because his legs, now that the round had ended, had started shaking in a way he hadn't let them do while it mattered. He kept his hand flat on the sand and let the tremor pass through his palm into the grit instead of into his voice or his face, because that was also something his father had taught him, a long time before any of this. The fear doesn't have to go anywhere but down. Above, on the second tier, a proctor's aide had reached the winch crewman and was speaking to him in the clipped, quiet cadence Dorothy used for questions they already suspected the answer to. Kes watched the crewman's shoulders come up defensive, watched him gesture toward Barrow without quite pointing, watched Barrow, 20 feet away, turn his head very slightly to register that this conversation was happening and show no reaction to it at all. Kes had known Threll Barrow for 2 years. He had eaten meals across from him, sparred against him in unarmed drills, listened to him talk for hours about rank slots and commission quotas, and how many places on this year's list would go to species who, in Barrow's words, hadn't earned a place at the table their grandparents built. Kes had laughed at some of it. Not all of it, but some, in the easy way you laugh at a friend's ugly opinions because disagreeing costs more than it's worth. It was costing him now. He could feel the bill coming due somewhere under his sternum ridge, a Dorothy's version of a stomach turning over, and he found himself walking toward the winch station without any clear plan for what he intended to say when he got there. "You didn't clear that with the proctor," Kes said, low to Barrow, close enough that the aide glanced over at the sound of his voice. "The proctor," Barrow said, "clears rounds. He doesn't run the drum. He runs the pit. Everything in the pit is his." Then he should have caught it faster. Barrow's eyespots, dark, flat, fully sighted where Aquarns were blind, settled on Kes with an expression that had never once in 2 years looked at him like this before. "You're not developing scruples over a wet blood, are you, Kes? 3 days ago, you were the one who put him on the roster's short list." "I put his name in a joke," Kes said. "I didn't rig a chit. I didn't fire a drum during a live round." "No," Barrow agreed. "You just handed me the opening. What I do with an opening is my business." He looked past Kes down at the sand, where Eli Marsh had finally come up off his knees and was standing again in the flat open ground, resuming his slow rocking count as if the last 90 seconds hadn't happened at all. "One more round like that and he folds. They always fold on the third. You've seen it before." Kes had seen it before. 2 cadets in 6 years, both folding somewhere in round 3, both carried out through the far gate while the gallery watched in the particular silence that follows a career ending in front of 200 witnesses. He had felt nothing at the time except the mild, distant relief of a boy watching someone else's failure and being grateful it wasn't his own. He did not feel that now. He felt, instead, an old cold certainty settling into him that whatever happened in round 3, he was no longer willing to simply watch it from the rail. Ressa Ilvain had not stayed at the rail through the whole of that second between. She had left it at a half-run, 90 seconds being a thin margin for what she meant to do, and taken the gallery stairs 2 at a time down to the officer of day station tucked behind the pit's outer wall, where a bored third-year adjutant sat monitoring a bank of compound-wide status boards that had nothing to do with the proving currently underway on the sand above him. "The resonance drum fired during a live round," she said, before he'd fully looked up from his board. "That's not calibration protocol. Someone triggered it deliberately." The adjutant, a broad, unhurried Dorothy named Corvin, whom Ressa knew only by reputation as someone who took his duties with exactly the minimum seriousness the job required, glanced at a secondary display that apparently confirmed what she'd said, because his expression shifted from bored to mildly interested rather than skeptical. "Proctor Ilker is aware," he said. "He's on the gallery floor himself. Has been since the drum fired. Didn't you see him move?" She hadn't. She'd been watching the sand, the way everyone had been watching the sand, and it hadn't occurred to her that the old proctor's stillness at the rail might have been anything other than the same paralysis gripping the rest of the gallery. "Then why hasn't he stopped it?" "Because stopping it is his call to make, not yours or mine," Corvin said, not unkindly. "And because a proctor who's run this pit for 31 years generally has reasons for what he does or doesn't do that aren't obvious to a second-year cadet standing at the rail for the first time watching something go wrong. I've seen him let worse-looking rounds run their course before, when he judged the cadet on the sand had more say in the outcome than the gallery gave them credit for. I've also seen him pull the lever in under 2 seconds when he judged otherwise. He hasn't pulled it. Take what confidence you can from that, because it's the only reassurance either of us gets to have." It was not much reassurance, and Ressa said so, and Corvin, visibly unbothered by being told his reassurance was insufficient, shrugged the particular Dorothy shrug that meant the matter was now outside his authority to improve. "You could report the tampering formally," he offered. "I can log an incident flag right now, on your word alone, and it'll route to the officer of the day within the hour. It won't stop round 3. It also won't undo it if round 3 goes badly. But it'll make sure whoever did this can't simply let the story die once the trial's over. Ressa gave her account standing at that station in under 2 minutes, precise and complete in the way 3 years of tactics training had built into her. Time sequence, the resonance drum's designation, her own position at the rail, Kes Doral's name included because she'd seen him at the winch station arguing with someone before the drum fired, and honesty demanded she log what she'd actually seen rather than what would be convenient to leave out. She did not yet know, giving that account, that Kes would independently name Barrow himself within the hour and make most of her report redundant. She gave it anyway, because a report given before the outcome was known meant more than one given after, and she had learned that lesson early enough in her own short career to trust it now. She was back at the rail with 11 seconds left in the between, breathing harder than the run down and back should have justified. And Kes, 3 places down along the stone, close enough now that she didn't have to raise her voice, glanced over at her return with an expression that asked a question he didn't have breath to voice. "I reported it," she said. "Officially, it's logged whatever happens next. It won't stop round 3. "No," she agreed. "But it means round 3 isn't the only thing anyone remembers about today." She looked past him, down at the sand, where Eli Marsh had risen from his knees and resumed the same patient rocking count he'd opened the whole trial with, as if the drum and the 90 seconds since it fired belonged to some other trial entirely. "I drew a juvenile for my own proving, 8 months ago. I stood in that same sand for 4 rounds and never once felt what I'm feeling right now, watching someone else's." She said it quietly, mostly to herself and Kes, who had no good answer for it and knew better by now than to offer a bad one, said nothing at all, and the two of them stood at the rail together in a silence that had, for the first time since the gate first opened, something like alliance in it instead of mere shared dread. The horn sounded, round 3 began. Down on the sand, the wardroom had not fully settled from the drum's strike. Eli could feel it in the ground the instant he resumed his count. The throb was there, 4 beats and a rest, but ragged at the edges, a fraction too fast. The animal's whole nervous architecture still keyed up from a shock that had come from nowhere and might, for all it knew, come again. He understood, with the particular clarity that comes to a person standing very close to something that could kill him, that the manual's advice to remain still was worse than useless right now. Stillness was what you offered an animal that already trusted the ground. This animal's trust in the ground had just been broken, and the only way back to it was to give it something steadier to listen to than its own fear. He started, very quietly, to hum. It wasn't a tune. It had no melody a Dorothy ear would have recognized as music, no melody at all really, just his own chest working a long low note in time with his 4 count, pitched as close as he could manage to the frequency he'd felt come up through his palm during round 2. He'd done something like it before, once, at 14, kneeling in a stock pen with a heifer that had gone through a fence in a lightning storm and wouldn't let anyone within 10 feet of her shaking flank, and his father had knelt beside him and hummed the same low note for 40 minutes until the animal's ears stopped pinning back. He did not have 40 minutes. He had 2 minutes and change, and a beast 11 times the mass of that heifer, and no one kneeling beside him. In the gallery, Kes Doral watched Threll Barrow's hand drift with studied casualness toward the sleeve pocket where Kes now understood, too late to have stopped it earlier. A second device was riding, not the resonance drum this time, which the aide's crewman had been pulled away from and which Barrow had clearly anticipated losing as an option. Something smaller, something Barrow could throw himself. "Don't," Kes said. "Don't what?" Barrow said, not looking at him, eyes on the pit, on the human kneeling now in the open sand with his chest working some low tuneless note that had, absurdly, actually made the wardroom's throat sac stop flaring quite so wide. "Whatever's in your hand." Barrow's eye spots flicked to him, and for the first time in the whole exchange, something like real anger showed through the flat calculation. Do you understand what happens to my slot if a wetblood posts distinguished composure on his file this term? Do you understand what that does to the quota math? There are 9 commission places for 400 cadets, Kess. Every one of them a human takes off the list is one of us that doesn't get it. That's not cruelty. That's arithmetic. It's a beast pit, Kess said, not a ledger. It's both. It's always been both. You just never had to notice because it was never your name on the short list. You're not going to throw that, Kess said, and reached for Barrow's wrist before he'd fully decided to. Barrow shrugged him off without much effort, a Dorothy 2 years senior, half a head taller, plated shoulders built for exactly this kind of contest, and the small motion sent Kess back a step against the rail, hard enough that a cadet beside him grabbed his arm to keep him upright. Careful, Barrow said, not even looking at him now, eyes fixed on the pit floor. Assaulting a superior classman during an active trial is the kind of thing that ends a career a great deal faster than a citation for a wetblood ever will. So is what you're holding, Kess said, and this time he didn't reach for the wrist again, because there was nothing left to grab that would stop it in time, and he understood, with a sick lurch he'd remember for a long while after, that the only thing left to do was watch. Down on the sand, the note had done something. Eli felt it before he understood it, a change in the throb under his knees, the ragged edge smoothing, 4 beats and a rest coming back into something closer to true, and the spine clusters that had been fanned wide in testing began, very slowly, to draw back in, folding toward the animal's own body the way a hand relaxes out of a fist. He kept humming. He did not open his eyes to see if it was working, because seeing it work might change the note without him meaning it to. And he had learned a long time ago that the moment you start performing calm instead of holding it, the animal in front of you always knows. The wardrum's massive head lowered by degrees until its jaw nearly touched the sand. That was the moment Barrow threw the device. It was small, a resonance chit no larger than a coin, and it hit the sand 8 feet from Eli with a flat percussive crack that had nothing rhythmic in it at all. A pure hard shock designed to do exactly what the drum had done in round 2, and this time there was no 90 seconds of settling behind it, and no fresh nerve left in the animal to absorb the insult. The wardrum came up off the sand in a single motion that flattened Eli's whole plan into something closer to instinct, and for 1 full second, in the gallery, in the pit, in Kess Dorrell's own frozen chest, there was no version of what happened next that ended without blood on the sand. Eli's wrestling had never been about strength. His coach back in Nebraska, a heavy-set man named Dabrowski who'd wrestled 2 years of junior college before a knee ended it, used to grab freshmen by the collar and tell them the same thing every August. You don't beat mass, you redirect it. He thought of one match in particular, without meaning to, in the half-second before his body committed to the role, regionals, junior year, a heavyweight from Kearney outweighing him by nearly 60 pounds, a kid built like a silo who had pinned every opponent that season in under a minute by sheer forward momentum. Eli had gone down twice in the first period doing exactly what his body wanted to do, bracing against that momentum, trying to hold ground the way you're taught to hold ground against anything smaller than you. And Dabrowski had screamed something from the corner between periods that Eli had needed a full season afterward to actually understand instead of just obey. Stop meeting force with force. You don't have the mass for it, and you never will. So quit fighting a fight you can't win on paper and start fighting the one you actually can. Third period, Eli had let the Kearney kid's next drive carry him sideways instead of backward, ridden the momentum instead of absorbing it, and come up behind him with an angle the kid's whole strategy had never once accounted for because nobody his size had ever needed to think about angles before. Eli had pinned him with 11 seconds left on the clock. It remained 4 years and 1 solar system away from that gym, the single cleanest piece of technical wrestling he had ever produced, and it was the only frame of reference his body had. In the half-second the wardrum's shoulder came around at him. That told him what to do with 30 times his own mass bearing down instead of 60 pounds. Eli redirected. As the wardrum's shoulder came around in a lunge that would have crushed him square if he'd stood his ground, he rolled instead, low, fast, inside the arc rather than away from it, the one place a novice would never think to go, and the one place a wrestler's whole education screamed was safest, and came up against the animal's own foreleg instead of under its jaw. A plate edge caught his shoulder on the way, tore his sleeve and the skin beneath it in a shallow line that would need stitches and would leave a scar he'd carry the rest of his life. And he felt it the way you feel a cut you can't yet spare the attention to be afraid of, distant and secondary. Because the far more urgent fact was that he was now pressed flat along the animal's own foreleg, close enough to feel its pulse thrum directly through the plate, and that changed everything about what he had left to work with. Dabrowski used to say it a different way for every freshman class, but the shape of it never changed. The second you're inside a bigger body's reach, distance stops being your friend and contact starts being your only tool. Eli had spent 3 years on a wrestling mat learning what that meant in his hips and his hands before he ever had to test it against something that outweighed him by a factor of 30. And every part of that training screamed the same instruction now that it had screamed in 100 practice rooms. Don't fight the mass, ride it. He let his own momentum carry him under the arc of the animal's shoulder instead of away from it, absorbing the graze along his arm rather than flinching from it, and came up pressed flat against warm plated hide with both feet still under him, low and balanced, exactly the position 3 years of takedown drills had built into his body without asking his permission. He didn't pull away. He pressed his torn shoulder harder against the leg, matched his ragged breathing to the animal's own racing thrum, and began, with his one good hand, to tap that same 4-count directly onto the plate itself, close enough now that there was no distance left for the signal to travel through sand at all, just skin against hide, pulse against pulse, the oldest kind of conversation there is. In the gallery someone screamed. It might have been Ressa. Kes didn't look to see. He was already moving, shoving past 2 cadets toward the winch station, toward the manual override lever that would flood the pit floor with the cooling mist meant for the between and might. By one more second of confusion, the wardrum's ancient reflexes could be interrupted by, and he had his hand on the lever before he registered that Proctor Vasson Ilker had already reached it first. The Proctor was old even by Dorothy standards, plated hide gone pale silver-gray at the ridges, and he moved with none of the urgency Kes expected from someone who had just watched a rigged trial nearly kill a cadet on his own floor. He looked instead at the sand, at the boy pressed flat along a beast's shaking foreleg with blood soaking through a torn sleeve, tapping a rhythm into hide with a hand that would not stop even though every other part of him had gone rigid with the effort of holding still, and the Proctor's hand came off the lever without pulling it. "Not yet," he said to Kes without turning his head. "Watch." Down on the sand, the wardrum's shoulder had stopped moving. It hadn't relaxed. Every muscle along its plated flank was still coiled tight enough to end a life in the next half-second, and its throat sac still flared and subsided in short, furious pulses, but it had stopped moving, held in the particular suspended stillness of an animal whose 2 competing instincts, flee the shock, answer the pulse pressed into its own hide, had for one long, unbearable moment come to a standstill against each other. Eli kept tapping. His shoulder was a slow, bright line of pain he had no room left to feel. He kept his 4-count going anyway, because stopping now, breaking the only thread of communication he had left, was the one thing guaranteed to end this badly, and somewhere behind his ribs his father's voice said again, quiet and certain, "Don't be the first thing to change your mind." He was not the first thing to change its mind. The wardrum's throat sac deflated slow and did not flare again. Its head, which had been raised in the coiled posture that preceded every charge Eli had read about in the sparse cadet manual, lowered by inches until its jaw came to rest against the sand, a body's length from his own face, close enough that he could see, for the first time, the fine gray scarring along its snout that told the story of 2 decades spent in a pit exactly like this one, being shocked and startled and blamed for the shocking and startling, over and over, by cadets who had never once thought to ask what the ground was telling it. The between horn sounded. Nobody in the gallery moved to cheer it. They just stood, 200 cadets pressed against a stone rail, absolutely silent, watching a human boy lie pressed along the foreleg of the deadliest animal in the compound, both of them breathing in the same slow, ragged rhythm, neither one moving first. The proctor's aide, a younger Dorothy named Van who had spent the last 2 rounds working her way steadily toward the truth, reached the winch station at almost the same moment the horn sounded, a scorched resonance chit already bagged in her hand, the crewman beside her giving his account in the flat, fast cadence of someone eager to place the blame anywhere but on himself. Kes heard enough of it to know the crewman had named Barrow twice before Van had even finished asking the question, and he watched Barrow hear it too, and watched him decide, with the same cold arithmetic he brought to everything, that denial would cost him more than silence. Proctor Ilker turned from the lever and looked, for a long moment, at Threll Barrow. "Escort Cadet Barrow to the officer of the day," he said, to no one in particular and to everyone at once, in a voice that carried the entire length of the gallery without being raised. "And bring me whatever is left of the device he just threw. I want it on my desk before this trial concludes." Barrow didn't run. There was nowhere to run to, on a stone rail 3 tiers up with 200 witnesses between him and any door, and he had the particular stillness of a man doing arithmetic on how much of this could still be salvaged. His eye spots found Kes across the gap between them, and Kes understood, with a clarity that felt like something breaking loose in his chest, that Barrow expected him to say nothing. Expected the same easy silence Kes had given him for 2 years of ugly opinions laughed off across a mess hall table. "He forged the roster chit 3 days ago," Kes said, loud enough for the aide beside the proctor to hear clearly. "I saw the original in the office myself before it was pulled, and the resonance drum wasn't calibration. He told the crewman himself to strike it if the trial went well. I heard him say it." The gallery, which had already been silent, found a deeper silence than that, the kind that has weight to it, and Threll Barrow looked at Kes Dorrell the way you look at a man who has just handed away something he can't get back, and did not say a single word in his own defense, because there was nothing left to say that the sand hadn't already contradicted. Down on the pit floor, in the 90 seconds of the between, Eli Marsh had not moved from where he lay along the wardroom's foreleg. Someone from the pit crew was already crossing the sand toward him with a field kit, moving slow and wide the way the proctor's own hand signals instructed, and Eli, without turning his head, without breaking the tap of his good hand against warm plated hide, said the first words he'd spoken since the gate closed on him. "Not yet. Let me finish the round." The crewman looked up at the gallery for instruction. Proctor Ilker, 40 feet up, gave a single small nod, and the crewman stopped where he was and waited. 1 round left. 3 minutes, on a beast that had just been shocked twice and had a boy's own blood drying against its plated foreleg, and a proctor who had, for reasons Kes did not yet understand, decided to let the trial run its full course, instead of ending it early the way regulation would have allowed him to at any point since round 2. Kes gripped the rail with both hands and did not look away, because he had spent 3 days looking away from what he'd started, and he was done with that now. "Why is he letting it finish?" Ressa asked low beside him. "After what Barrow did. He could end it right now, and no one on this rail would say a word against him for it." "Because ending it now would still put a fail mark on Marsh's file," Kes said, working it out as he said it, the way you sometimes only understand your own proctor by trying to explain him to someone else. A trial interrupted for cause doesn't get expunged. It gets annotated. Barrow doesn't just want him hurt. He wants the record to say he couldn't finish. Ilker knows that. He's not protecting the beast right now. He's protecting the only clean way there is to prove Barrow wrong. He looked down at the sand, at Eli Marsh climbing slowly back to his feet with one hand still pressed flat to the animal's foreleg. The boy's the one who has to do the proving part. The horn sounded round 4. Down on the sand, Eli felt the wardrum's whole body tense at the sound, an old conditioned response to a signal it had learned over 20 years of provings, meant something new was about to be asked of it, and he tapped his 4 count a little firmer against its hide to say, as clearly as a hand could say it, not this time. Nothing new. Same as before. He rose slowly, one careful joint at a time, keeping one palm flat against the animal's foreleg the whole way up so the contact never fully broke, and stood at last at his full height beside a creature that could have ended him with a single indifferent shrug of its shoulder, and did not step back. The manual, if anyone had bothered to write an honest one, would have said this was the point past which no cadet in 6 years had gone. Every prior proving against the wardrum had ended with distance, a cadet frozen at the far wall, a cadet retreating step by step toward the Sally gate, a cadet finally breaking and running with the animal a half-length behind. Nobody had ever stood this close, on their own 2 feet, with a hand still resting against living hide, and simply stayed. The throat sac, which had gone quiet during the last 90 seconds of the between, began again its long low throb, 4 beats and a rest, and this time there was nothing ragged in it at all. It had found its own rhythm again, and Eli, standing beside its jaw with his torn shoulder throbbing in the same rough time, understood that the sound was no longer a threat display or an alarm. It was closer now, to the low, contented hum 11 hives make on a clover morning when nothing in the whole yard has any reason to be afraid, and he let himself, for the first time since the gate closed behind him, breathe out something that wasn't a count. In the gallery, nobody spoke. Kess had watched provings for 3 years and had never once seen a gallery this quiet during a live round. No murmurs, no bets muttered between cadets, not even the shuffle of boots against stone. 200 people stood at that rail and watched a boy from a species they'd been taught, generation after generation, ran too hot and too fast and too thin-blooded for real nerve, stand shoulder to jaw with the compound's oldest killer and simply exist there, unhurried, uncrushed, breathing in time with something none of them had ever managed to read at all. Kess found himself counting the seconds the way he'd counted them in 3 years of drills, out of pure old habit, and the count told him something he hadn't expected. Eli hadn't moved in over a minute. Not a flinch, not a shift of weight beyond the same patient 4-count rocking he'd opened the whole trial with, as if nothing that had happened in the last 9 minutes, not the drum, not the thrown chit, not the shallow tear still bleeding through his sleeve, had changed anything about the one simple thing he decided to do the moment the gate closed on him. Ressa, beside Kess, had both hands pressed flat to the rail stone now, and for the first time since Kess had known her, she looked like she'd forgotten to keep her face composed for the room. The wardrum's head turned, slow, toward him. It was not a charge. Every cadet on that rail who had trained 2 years to recognize the difference between a charge and its absence understood, in the same instant, that this was something else entirely. The deliberate, unhurried turn of an animal orienting itself toward the one thing in its whole territory it had decided, after 4 rounds of being shocked and misread and finally understood, did not need to be destroyed. Its jaw came to rest, with a weight that would have broken a lesser structure than raked amber sand, an arm's length from where Eli stood. He reached out, slow, telegraphed, the same unhurried motion he'd have used walking up on a spooked yearling, and set his palm flat against the ridge above its blind eye spot, where the plate gave way to something closer to hide, warm and faintly rough under his fingers, and felt the animal's whole vast body exhale. Nobody in the gallery breathed either, for a 3 count that felt considerably longer than 3, and then the horn sounded the end of round 4, and the trial, by every rule in the Academy's book, was over. Eli Marsh did not move his hand right away. He stood in the settling amber light with his palm against a killer's brow and his shoulder bleeding into a sleeve that would need to be cut away and thrown out, and let the horn's echo die all the way down before he finally, carefully, drew his hand back and took one slow step toward the Sally gate, and the wardroom did not rise to follow him, and did not need to, because there was nothing left in that pit for it to be afraid of. That was the moment the gallery broke its silence, and it did not break it the way Kess expected. There was no cheer, no roar of the kind that followed a clean, unarmed drill win in the training yard. What went up instead from 200 throats at once was something quieter and stranger, a long collective exhale, half of it Dorothy words Kess had heard exactly twice before in his life, both times at funerals for officers who died well. A phrase that had no clean translation into common, but that meant, roughly, the ground itself bears witness. Among the pit crew crossing the sand to collect their equipment, one older Dorothy stood apart from the rest for a long moment before moving at all. Her name was Orsa Vantil, senior handler for the South Compound, and she had cared for the animal cadets called the Wardroom for 15 of its 20 years in the pit, longer than any other single person on staff, feeding it, treating its wounds after provings that left it as marked as the cadets it faced, and never once, in 15 years, touching it without a sedative dart in hand first. She had not moved to help when the resonance chit fired in round 3, because regulation forbade crew intervention during a live round, and because, if she was honest with herself standing there afterward, some old professional instinct had told her that intervening would only have made whatever was about to happen worse. She had watched instead, hands white-knuckled on her own equipment belt, certain she was about to watch an animal she'd spent 15 years trying to understand kill a cadet on her own watch, and had felt something close to grief already forming before the moment passed and did not, in the end, arrive. 15 years, she said, to no one in particular, crossing the sand afterward with her sedative kit still sealed and unused in her hand, and I have never once put my bare palm on that ridge above its eye. I didn't know you could. She looked at Eli with an expression that was not quite envy and not quite grief but held pieces of both. I used to think it hated this pit, hated all of us. I fed it for 15 years telling myself that was just its nature, that some animals are simply built unreachable, and I never once considered that the pit might have taught it that, the same way you teach a wound to flinch from the hand that keeps reopening it. It's not your fault, Eli said. Nobody wrote the manual to hurt it on purpose. No, Orsa agreed. We wrote it to survive it, and we told ourselves that was the same as understanding it, because it was easier than admitting we'd never tried. She knelt, slow and careful, a body length from where the animal now lay with its jaw resting against the settling sand, and did not reach out to touch it, not yet, watching instead the way its throat sac rose and fell in that long, even rhythm Eli had spent 4 rounds learning to answer. I would like to learn what you did, properly. Not as a curiosity for a report. I have 15 years left in me at this compound if my knees hold out, and I would rather spend them doing this than what I've been doing. Ilker's going to want the same thing, Eli said. He already told me the manual needs rewriting. I don't think either of you are going to have much trouble finding time for it. Orsa allowed herself then, the first real smile Eli had seen on her in the whole short time he'd known her, and reached out slow, telegraphed, the exact unhurried motion Eli had used himself an hour before, and set 2 careful fingers against the plated ridge of the wardroom's foreleg, the closest point she could reach without crowding the animal's lowered head. It did not flinch. It did not, this time, need a sedative dart within reach for either of them to trust the moment would hold. Proctor Ilker was already moving down the gallery stairs toward the pit floor gate, and Kess found himself moving too, without deciding to, pushing past cadets who parted for him without seeming to notice they were doing it. Because everyone on that rail wanted to be closer to whatever had just happened, and Kess wanted, more than that, to be the one standing at the gate when it opened. The Sally door ground up into its housing, and Eli Marsh stepped through it under his own power, favoring his cut shoulder, sand still clinging to his knees, and stopped there in the narrow stone corridor as if he hadn't expected anyone to be waiting. Kess had spent 3 days rehearsing, without quite admitting to himself he was rehearsing it, what he might say if this ever came to a moment like this one. None of it survived contact with the boy's actual face, tired, pale under a fresh sunburn of adrenaline, eyes still carrying the flat, unhurried focus of someone who hadn't yet let himself feel the last 4 minutes. "You knew," Eli said, not an accusation, a question dressed as a statement the way tired people ask things. "Not soon enough," Kess said. "I knew about the chit an hour before the gate opened. I should have stopped it at the roster office instead of standing at the rail deciding whether I had the right to." Eli considered that for a moment, weight shifting off his cut shoulder, and something in his face, not quite forgiveness, not yet, but the deliberate setting aside of a grievance that could wait, settled into something closer to simple exhaustion. "You said something." "During round 3, I heard a voice from the gallery." "I told Barrow not to throw the second device," Kess said. "For whatever that's worth, it clearly wasn't much." "It's worth something," Eli said. "I heard it land somewhere I could use it, didn't have room to do anything with it at the time." He looked past Kess, down the corridor toward the pit crew already crossing the sand with the wide, slow steps the manual prescribed, moving toward the wardroom with a caution that had, Eli suspected, just become permanently unnecessary in a way none of them understood yet. Is it going to be all right, after all that? Kess had never once, in 3 years at Ordesa, heard a cadet ask after the beast that had nearly killed him. He didn't have a ready answer, and found, to his own mild surprise, that he wanted one badly enough to go find it. Proctor Ilker reached them before he could say so. The old Doretha's plated face carried an expression Kess had seen perhaps twice in 3 years of serving under him. Not the flat professional neutrality of a proctor administering a trial, but something closer to a man recalculating a sum he'd trusted for decades, and finding it had never once added up the way he'd assumed. "Cadet Marsh," Ilker said, "field medic is 3 minutes out. Sit before you decide otherwise." Eli sat, on the low stone bench built into the corridor for exactly this purpose, and the proctor lowered himself with the slow economy of the very old onto the bench beside him, an unusual proximity that made the pit crew glance up from the sand in mild surprise. "I have run this trial for 31 years. I have never once in 31 years seen anyone stand where you stood in round 4. Not a cadet, not a handler with 15 years service. Not myself, and I have been closer to that animal than most anyone alive." He was quiet a moment, watching the crew work. "The manual will need to be rewritten. I intend to write it myself, and I intend to ask you what you did in detail before I do." "It wasn't a technique," Eli said. "Not one I could teach out of a book, anyway. It's just the ground was telling everybody something the whole time. Nobody was listening to it. I grew up somewhere I learned too." "Then you will teach it anyway," Ilker said, "because I have 400 cadets on this compound and at least 390 of them are never going to grow up somewhere that teaches it, and I would rather they learn it from you than lose another hand, or another cadet, to an animal that was never the problem to begin with." He rose, plate settling with the faint dry sound of age. "Your file will read distinguished composure, the first such mark issued at this trial in 11 years. I am also entering a formal reprimand against Cadet Barrow for tampering with a live evaluation, which will very likely end his commission track entirely, and a citation for Cadet Dorrell for coming forward against a superior classman when it would have cost him nothing to stay silent." He looked at Kess directly for the first time. "It cost you something anyway, didn't it?" Some, Kess admitted. Good, Ilker said without unkindness. The ones it costs nothing are usually lying about having done it at all. He turned back toward the pit floor, toward the crew now crouched a cautious distance from the wardrum's lowered head, and added, almost as an afterthought, in the tone of a much younger man surprised by his own decision. I am also reassigning primary handling contact for this specimen to Cadet Marsh, pending medical clearance, effective this term. It has never once accepted contact from anyone on the staff, without sedation first. I would like to understand why it accepted his, and I suspect the animal will explain it a great deal more honestly than the two of us can. He walked off down the corridor to deal with the paperwork that follows any trial's ending, leaving the two of them on the stone bench in a quiet that had nothing hostile left in it at all. Kess sat down slowly on the bench's other end, close enough that Eli could have moved away and didn't. For a long moment neither of them said anything, listening to the pit crew's low voices carry across the sand, to a sound Kess was only now, for the first time in his life, hearing clearly enough to recognize as something other than noise. A slow, even throb, 4 beats and a rest, coming steady and unafraid from the far side of the wall. For what it's worth, Kess said finally, I didn't dare you into that pit because I thought you'd die in it. I dared you because I thought you'd be scared enough to make it interesting. I didn't think past that. I should have. I know, Eli said. I heard you laughing when the gate opened. Kess had no answer for that because it was true, and because there was no version of an apology that unmade 3 days of a joke he'd let run further than he'd ever meant it to. He did the only other thing available to him instead, reached across the gap on the bench and pressed the back of his 4-fingered hand flat against his own sternum ridge, then extended it, palm up, toward Eli, the old formal Dorothy gesture of respect between equals that Kess had given exactly twice before in his life, both times to instructors twice his age with commendations Kess could only hope to earn someday. He had never once imagined giving it to a first-term human cadet with sand still in his hair. Eli looked at the offered hand for a moment, unsure of the custom but reading, correctly, the weight behind it, and clasped it. Human grip, 5 fingers instead of 4, warm where Dorothy hands ran cool, and held it a beat longer than either of them strictly needed to. You're going to have to teach me the actual gesture, Eli said. I probably did that wrong. You did it exactly right, Kess said, and found, to his own surprise, that he meant it in a way that went well past the hand. Behind the stone wall, the pit crew had finally coaxed the wardroom up onto its feet and was walking it, slow and unhurried, toward the holding gate at the pit's far end. And it went without struggle, without the sedative collar the manual had required for 2 decades. Its throat sac giving off that same low, even throb the whole way, 4 beats and a rest. The sound of something that had finally, after 20 years in a stone circle built to test other people's nerve, been asked a question by someone patient enough to wait for the answer. The medic arrived a minute later and found 2 cadets sitting on a corridor bench, one of them bleeding through a torn sleeve and neither of them in any particular hurry to stop talking, and had to ask twice before Eli finally rolled up what was left of his shirt and let her get to work, still watching, past her shoulder, the last of the sand settle where the wardroom's tracks had crossed it. The ground gone quiet at last, and telling, for the first time in a very long while. Nothing anyone in that pit needed to be afraid of. The medical bay smelled like antiseptic and, faintly, of the same mineral dust that clung to everything in the amber pit. And Eli sat on the edge of an exam table scaled, like everything else at Ordesa, for a frame slightly larger than his own, while a Dorothy Field medic named Sennett cleaned the tear along his shoulder with a brisk efficiency that suggested she'd stitched worse, and would again before the term was out. You're fortunate, she said, not looking up from the suture line. A hand's width lower and that plate edge would have caught the joint instead of the muscle. You'd be looking at a very different conversation with a very different specialist. She tied off the last stitch and sat back to inspect her own work with the flat, critical eye of someone who took pride in a clean line regardless of the patient's species. "It'll scar. I could minimize it if you wanted a cosmetic pass, but that takes a second session, and most cadets, in my experience, end up wanting the scar left visible once they've had a night to think about it." "Leave it," Eli said, without needing the night to think about it, and Sennett made a small sound that might have been approval. Kes and Ressa found him there 20 minutes later, having talked their way past the duty nurse with the particular confidence of upperclassmen who knew exactly which rules bent for them and which didn't. And Kes stopped in the doorway for a moment before coming the rest of the way in, as if crossing the threshold required a decision. He hadn't finished making out in the corridor. "They're saying Ilker's filing the reprimand tonight," Kes said. "Barrow's already been moved out of upper-class quarters. Separate wing, pending the hearing." He said it flatly, an information delivery rather than a celebration, and Eli, sitting with a fresh line of stitches under a bandage and the particular hollowed-out fatigue that follows any real fear once the fear itself has passed, recognized the flatness for what it was. A boy still working out how to feel about a 2-year friendship ending in a single afternoon, and finding no version of the feeling that came pre-labeled. "You don't have to be glad about it," Eli said. "For what it's worth, I wouldn't be either if it was someone I'd known that long." "I'm not glad," Kes said. "I'm relieved, which isn't the same thing and isn't as good a thing either. I keep waiting to feel something cleaner than that, and it isn't coming." He pulled a stool over from against the wall and sat, uninvited, close enough that Ressa, who had stayed standing near the door, arms crossed, watching the exchange with the careful attention of someone still cataloging how she felt about all of it herself, allowed herself the ghost of a smile at the easy familiarity of it. Two people who'd known each other 4 minutes acting already, like it had been considerably longer. "I reported the drum," Ressa said from the doorway when the silence had gone on a moment too long. "Officially, before round 3 ended. I wanted you to know, in case it matters to you, that someone did it before they knew how the round would end." "It matters," Eli said, and meant it, and something in Ressa's shoulders came down half an inch that had been up, Eli suspected, since well before he'd noticed her at all. "I don't think I said thank you to either of you yet, for any of it." "You don't have to," Kes said. "I'm the reason you were in there in the first place." "You're also the reason Barrow's not going to do it to anyone else," Eli said. "I can hold both of those about you at the same time. Doesn't seem that hard, actually, now that I've had practice holding a lot bigger things still today." That surprised a short laugh out of Kes, the first unguarded sound Eli had heard him make since the gate closed, and Sennett, packing away her kit with the long-suffering patience of medical staff everywhere, told them all three to get out and let the boy sleep, and reminded them it was a proctor's request and not a suggestion. The formal hearing convened 4 days after the trial, in a chamber Eli had never had reason to enter before, narrower than a classroom, ringed by a horseshoe of seating scaled for a review board of 5, with a single bare stool at the center for whoever was being asked to account for themselves. Eli was not required to attend as a party to the proceedings. Cadets whose provings had been compromised were entitled to submit a written account instead, and let the board proceed without them. He went anyway, in a clean uniform with the fresh line of stitches still tender under his sleeve, because his father had taught him a long time ago that showing up for a thing was its own kind of testimony, whether or not anyone called your name. Threll Barrow's father arrived an hour before the hearing opened, in the same formal service tunic Kes remembered from the parents' visitation 2 years earlier, and spent that hour in the corridor outside the chamber speaking in a low, controlled voice to anyone from the review board willing to stop and listen. Not denying what his son had done, Kes noted, standing close enough to hear without meaning to eavesdrop, but reframing it over and over. In the particular language of inheritance and grievance Kes had heard second-hand from Barrow himself for 2 years, and was now hearing delivered fresh, at full strength, from its actual source. A young man's frustration with a quota system 4 generations of his family had opposed on principle. A moment of poor judgment under pressure no one on the review board had ever had to feel themselves. A career worth salvaging, surely, against the weight of one incident. Proctor Ilker, arriving with the unhurried economy of a man who had sat through every version of this argument before and found none of them new, did not stop to listen at all. He walked past Barrow's father without acknowledgement, into the chamber, and took the review board's center seat with the particular stillness of someone who had already decided what he intended to say and saw no benefit in rehearsing it twice. The hearing itself took less than 40 minutes, which surprised Kess more than anything said inside it. He had expected the machinery of institutional consequence to grind slower, the way it always seemed to in the stories cadets told each other about upperclassmen who'd gotten away with worse. Barrow gave his account first, and it was, Kess thought, watching from the gallery seating along the back wall, the most honest he had ever heard him. No denial of the forged chit, no denial of his instruction to the resonance drum crewman, only a flat recitation of facts delivered in the voice of someone who had run out of angles to argue and had decided belatedly that dignity in defeat was the only asset he had left to protect. He did not mention the quota once. Kess noticed the absence and understood it as the truest thing Barrow said all morning, that whatever arithmetic he'd recited at the winch station in the heat of the trial, faced now with a review board and his own father's carefully rehearsed reframing sitting one row back, he seemed to have finally run out of appetite for saying it out loud. Kess testified next when the board called his name and found that the account he gave was shorter than he'd expected it to be too. The roster chit, the winch station, the 2 words he'd said to Barrow that had gone unheeded, the moment he'd finally spoken up in front of the gallery instead of after. He did not embellish it and did not soften it, and when a board member, a severe, older Dorothy woman with a voice that carried no particular warmth but no particular cruelty either, asked him why he'd waited as long as he had to say anything, he answered honestly, because he'd decided somewhere on the walk over that honesty was the only currency worth spending in that room. Because he was my friend, Kess said, and I kept believing, right up until the drum fired, that whatever he was planning couldn't actually be as bad as what I was afraid it was. I was wrong. I understood I was wrong about halfway through round 2, and I still waited until round 3 to say anything out loud, and I don't have a better excuse for that gap than that it's hard to accuse someone you've eaten 100 meals with. That's not a defense. It's just true. The board recorded Barrow's reprimand within the hour, formal removal from the officer commission track, effective immediately, with a notation permitting him to complete the academic term in a non-command discipline if he chose to remain at Ordesa at all, which everyone in that chamber understood without anyone saying so, he almost certainly would not. Barrow's father left without speaking to his son again in the corridor, walking past him with the same brisk unacknowledging stride he'd used on Proctor Ilker an hour earlier, and Kess watching that particular cruelty land on a boy who'd spent 2 years inheriting his father's grievances as carefully as a family sidearm. Felt, for one unwelcome moment, something almost like pity, before he remembered whose blood had nearly ended up on the sand because of exactly that inheritance, and let the pity go without much of a fight. Barrow did not return to Ordesa the following term. Kess heard, second-hand, months later, that he had transferred to a trade station technical program on the same station his own father repaired atmospheric processors for a living, a detail Kess turned over for a long while without ever quite deciding what to feel about the symmetry of it. Orsa Vantil came to find Eli on the 6th of those 9 days, in the mess hall rather than the pit, still in her handler's coveralls with sand dust caught in the creases, and set a data slate down on the table between them instead of a tray. "The wardroom has eaten twice this week without a sedative in the feed," she said, without preamble, in the same flat, unbothered register Eli was learning to recognize as her version of excitement. It hasn't done that in 15 years on record. I keep waiting for it to be a fluke, and it keeps not being one. She tapped the slate, where a rough chart tracked throat sac readings against feeding times, her own handwriting crowding the margins the way the naturalists had crowded the margins of pages decades older. I would like your help writing the rest of this down properly, if you have an hour a week to spare it, not for a report. For the next handler who inherits an animal everyone's told them is unreachable, so they don't spend 15 years finding out the hard way that it wasn't. I've got the hour, Eli said, and meant it, and Orsa nodded once, the particular economical nod of someone who had expected the answer, and was relieved regardless to hear it said out loud. Weapons Master Coral did not attend the hearing, tactics instructors having no standing before a conduct review board, but he found Eli 2 days after it concluded, at the same mess hall table where the whole matter had started 3 weeks earlier, and set his own tray down across from him without asking if the seat was taken. I marked your northern vector answer correct, Coral said, without preamble, in the clipped instructional cadence Eli recognized from 100 wall display drills. I flagged it to the ranking board the same week. I want you to understand that I would have flagged it regardless of what happened afterward in that pit. The tactical read stood on its own merits before any of this started, and it stands on them still. He ate in silence for a moment, the particular unhurried silence of a Dorothy deciding how much more to say. What I did not anticipate was that marking a first year's answer correct in front of an audience would set in motion the rest of it. I have turned that over more than I expected to, this past week. It's not on you, Eli said. Barrow made his own choice. You didn't hand him the chit. No, Coral agreed. But I have taught tactics at this compound for 9 years, and I have watched cadets like Barrow sit in my classroom the entire time without once, until 3 weeks ago, seeing what that particular ideology actually costs when it's given a lever to pull. I marked a board correct. I did not think about what marking it correct, in front of the wrong audience, might set loose in someone already looking for a reason. He set down his utensil, met Eli's eyes with the same flat, evaluating attention he brought to a drill scenario. I am revising my own curriculum this term, not the tactics. The tactics were sound, and will remain sound regardless of who solves them fastest. The part I am revising is the part where I assumed a correct answer, marked correctly, could not also become a weapon in someone else's hand. I did not used to think that was my responsibility to anticipate. I have changed my mind about that, this month, same as Ilker has changed his about the manual. It was, Eli understood, as close to an apology as a weapons master with 9 years of rank and a reputation for clipped instructional cadence was ever likely to offer a first-year cadet, and he took it for what it was rather than pushing for more. For what it's worth, Eli said, the northern vector was actually the weak point. That part didn't stop being true just because of everything that happened after. Coral allowed himself something almost like a smile, brief and dry. No, he said, it didn't. That's rather the point of tactics, cadet. The board doesn't care what happens to the people reading it correctly, only whether they read it correctly at all. He picked his tray back up, rose, and paused a moment longer before walking off toward the instructor's table. The ranking board convenes in the spring. I expect your name will be on considerably more of its documents than the northern vector by the time it does. 9 days later, Threll Barrow's name came off the officer track roster for good, quietly, the way most disciplinary matters at Ordesa ended. No assembly, no announcement, just a slot in the next quota cycle that opened up and stayed open, and a cadet who no longer sat at the mess hall table he'd sat at for 2 years. Kess did not go looking for him to say anything about it. There was nothing left worth saying that the sand hadn't already said better. The gallery above the amber pit was full again on the morning Proctor Ilker held the first session of what the compound had already started calling, informally, and against his own preference for plainer language, the reading. 40 cadets stood at the rail this time instead of 200, all of them second years who would draw their own provings before the term's end. And down on the raked amber sand a boy in a clean uniform with a fresh pink line of scar tissue showing where his sleeve had once torn knelt at the edge of the pit with his palm flat against the ground, showing them, one at a time, how to feel a rhythm that had been there the whole time, in every proving for 31 years. Waiting on cadets who had never once been taught to listen for it. The wardroom lay nearby, unchained, uncollared, its wedge head resting against Eli's knee in a posture the manual had no name for, and that Proctor Ilker, standing at the pit's edge with a date a slate he had not once glanced down at, was already drafting one for. Every so often a cadet in the gallery would ask a question that made the old proctor smile in a way none of them had seen from him before, and every time he let Eli answer it first. One of those questions came from a lean, nervous second year named Ovid Sar, standing near the back of the gallery with her arms wrapped around herself in a way that had nothing to do with the compound's climate control. And when she finally worked up to asking it, her voice carried further than she'd clearly intended it to, silencing the scattered side conversations along the rail. "What if you don't feel calm?" she said. "What if you've read everything and you understand the rhythm, and you still can't make yourself stand still because your body won't listen to what your head already knows? What then?" Kess understood watching Eli consider the question rather than simply answer it. The question every cadet on that rail had actually come to ask, dressed up in 40 different smaller questions about breath counts and spine clusters and throat sac patterns, because it was easier to ask about technique than to ask, plainly, whether courage was a thing you either had or didn't. "Then you're normal," Eli said, "and the manual's been lying to you about that too." He glanced down at the wardroom's head resting against his knee, at the fine gray scarring along its snout that Ovid, from the rail, couldn't yet see the way Eli had learned to see it. "I was scared the whole time, every round. I didn't stop being scared, I just stopped letting the scared part vote on what my feet did. Those aren't the same thing, and nobody ever tells you they're not the same thing, because it's easier to teach, 'Don't be afraid,' than it is to teach, 'Be afraid and do it anyway,' even though the second one's the only version that's ever actually true for anybody standing where you're about to stand." He looked back up at her, found her eyes across the width of the pit. "You don't need to arrive down here already calm. You need to arrive down here willing to let your hands do something steadier than what your chest is doing. That's a smaller, meaner ask, and it's also the only one that's honest." Ovid didn't say anything else, but Kess watched something settle in her shoulders that hadn't been there when she'd asked. The same half-inch of released tension he'd watched settle into Ressa's shoulders in a medical bay 9 days earlier, and understood that whatever Ordessa had actually gained from the last 9 days, it wasn't only a rewritten manual or a disgraced cadet's empty seat at the mess hall. It was this, a boy answering a scared girl's question honestly, in a pit that had spent 31 years teaching cadets to perform a calm none of them actually felt, and a gallery finally hearing someone admit, out loud, that the performance had never been the point. Kess stood at the rail where he'd stood 9 days earlier, in almost the same spot, watching almost the same scene, and understood that nothing about it looked the same at all. He was no longer a boy leaning over a stranger being shoved through a gate. He was standing beside Ressa, who had asked to be assigned second in the reading sessions the moment Ilker announced them, and across the pit floor, when Eli glanced up and found him in the crowd, Kess did the thing he'd started doing 3 days after the trial and had not once stopped doing since. He lifted his 4-fingered hand from the rail, pressed it briefly to his own sternum ridge, and held Eli's eyes until the boy nodded back. It cost him nothing now. It had cost him something once, and he had paid it, and what was left afterward was simply this: a killer asleep against a boy's knee in the warm amber light, a proctor rewriting 31 years of doctrine because he'd finally been made to watch it fail, and a gallery of cadets learning, for the first time in the history of that pit, to listen to the ground instead of merely standing on it. Eli's father's reply had not arrived yet. It would not arrive for another 13 days, the subspace relay caring nothing for how much had changed in the meantime. And Eli had stopped checking the terminal queue every morning the way he had the first week, because his father had also taught him that the waiting itself was not a thing to spend worry on, only a thing to let pass. When the reply finally came, it would be short, the way George Marsh's replies always were, 4 lines about the bees and 1 line near the bottom that Eli would read a great many more times than the length of it strictly warranted. Sounds like you found out the same thing I did, standing in that bee yard all those mornings. The fear doesn't leave. You just get better company for it. Proud of you, son. Come home and show me sometime. For now, kneeling in the amber sand with a killer's breath warm against his knee, and a compound full of cadets finally learning to listen, Eli did not yet need the words to know they'd be true when they came.